Once upon a time, long ago, before the gods and demigods of our ancestors in the homeland, before Julius Caesar governed in Rome, when there were no church bells calling to the fair, and the books of the Bible were not yet written, there prevailed a golden goddess over skies and earth. All people belonged to the sun and worshipped its sunshine. The sun warms up the earth when the goddess combs over the earth with her golden rays of hair, as she does always at midday. Humans forgot that it is like that, because it is written nowhere in the Bible, but it is like that. There came a day when humans no longer admired the sun goddess. That insulted her, but nevertheless, she didn't want to remove the necessary rays from humans, so long as it would give warmth to their hearts. If the rays should cool off, however, the goddess would turn away and would give her warming light to another world which had earned it more. This is what the sun goddess announced before a crowd of 7 leading knights, and she raised these to be her eternal servants. The knights were to come together and give themselves a secret title that only they could recognize. They should build a magnificent castle then, with 4 turrets after the directions of the wind, and an inner court of special place. In the center of the special place, a base was to stand, and beside it, a tellus gate. Against this tellus gate, climbing roses should be planted, and soon they would adorn it beautifully. In addition, the knight should create a golden figure, formed after the goddess's instruction. Through this figure she would speak to her knights. If they put the figure up at midday on its base in the center of the special place in the court. The knights did everything completely and exactly, just as the sun goddess had instructed them. For the first time, the golden figure was set up at midday in the center of the courtyard, and the goddess spoke to them there with these words. I greet you, my noble lonely knights. Thus I call you, because you will be lonely, because the eternal ones are always lonely. Such are you. While other humans of this earth die and are pulled into far regions, either good or bad, to you such dying is not. If you need a new body because the old is used up, then I give you a new. You must live as humans on this earth from now until at least 1 times 777 years, or it may however also be twice or 3 times this time interval. The years will seem eternal and at the same time lonely. Knights of the demigod light, I now give you your orders. 777 years shall be given to the earth and its inhabitants, starting now. The golden figure by which I speak to you will guard the earth for so long. Your castle will be purged with time, and humans will not see anything but rubble. For you, however, nothing is destroyed. It lives in intact splendor. For the mortal, it will be invisible. The sound splendor of your castle will not be visible for them. It is, however, needful for you to become at any time visible, to do palpable things if it is needed. Since you are now only a few, a larger crowd of lonely knights is necessary, in order that your order may be quite fulfilled. It is for you to select from among the daughters of humans the most beautiful and noble, and to sleep with them for 7 days and 7 nights without break. Thus shall you transfer your immortality to these your wives. The children who you witness with them will not be immediately eternal, but I will give this power to them. Now I want you to go forth for the first 7 years. 1 goes into northern Germany and takes himself a woman there. 1 goes into northern Italy and takes himself a woman there. 1 goes to France and takes himself a woman there. 1 goes into southern Italy and takes himself a woman there. 1 goes to Spain and takes himself a woman there. 1 goes to Hungary and takes himself a woman there. 1 remains in southern Germany and Austria and takes himself a woman here. Send your first son and your first daughter to this your castle. The golden figure will speak through me and instruct them all further. Thus, the mystery crowd of the eternal lonely knights was formed over time.
It was the panic of 1907. Wall Street was crowded from the Washington statue to Trinity Church. 3,000 people had crammed the streets, desperately trying to get their money out of the failing banks. Police were unable to hold back the angry mob. When the banks closed their doors, windows were smashed. Headlines read, "Another bank president shoots himself." Reporters were getting photographs to accompany the front page news. President Teddy Roosevelt was under pressure to take drastic action and was forced to ask for the help of a man he despised, J.P. Morgan. But this powerful banker had his own ideas as he watched the panic from the windows of his towering office. 10 Days at Jekyll Island recreates this historic drama in stunning detail and reveals the hidden hand that shaped the destiny of America. A secret meeting they said did not exist, a duck hunt that never was, men with no names, drinking 80-year-old scotch as they laid the plan for nothing less than an economic takeover of the nation. In November of 1910, the heads of the most powerful banking institutions in America boarded a private railroad car in New Jersey for a 1,000-mile journey to Jekyll Island in Georgia. The bankers were told to come to the station separately and not to acknowledge each other in public. Even after boarding the private car, they were told to address each other by first names only. It was important that no one, not even the servants on board the train, be allowed to know their last names. The destination was Jekyll Island, a private retreat for multimillionaires, away from reporters and prying eyes. The purpose was to participate in one of the most clandestine meetings in all history. Secrecy was so important that the regular staff had been replaced by temporary servants who would be unlikely to recognize the faces of these men. 10 Days at Jekyll Island literally were 10 days that shook the world.
"100 years ago, as war raged in the Middle East, a secret treaty was signed that defined national boundaries and still impacts upon the region today.
In the Hijaz, in western Arabia, Sharif Hussein, its ruler, was set on extending his political and geographical domain. He believed he might be able to do it with the help of the British. In turn, the British were impressed by Sharif Hussein's family credentials as custodians of the holy places of Islam.
They called themselves Hashemites. They called the family Hashemites because that's the family or the tribe of the Prophet Muhammad. They were the Bani Hashim, the sons of Hashim. So Sharif Hussein was the leader of the Hashemites. He was the person responsible for Mecca and Medina. And although he had worked with the Ottomans before the First World War, once the First World War happened, he saw this was his chance.
A chance, too, for the British, who saw support for Sharif Hussein as a way to threaten the Sultan's hold on the Caliphate, the political leadership of the Islamic world.
The British, because they were fighting the Ottomans, and the Ottomans were claiming to be the real representatives of Islam, they wanted a counterforce. And the counterforce was represented by Sharif Hussein, being a descendant of the Prophet. But Sharif Hussein was speaking of liberating Arab lands, building a new national state. He wanted to be king of the Arabs, not simply of Arabians.
In July 1915, Sharif Hussein smuggled a message to the British High Commissioner in Cairo, Sir Henry McMahon, offering to raise a substantial Arab force against the Ottomans in return for British support for Arab independence. In the ensuing secret correspondence between the two men, Sharif Hussein was given to understand that he could expect British support in achieving some of his ambitions in the event of an Ottoman defeat. This letter of October the 26th, 1915, outlined the main points of the arrangement.
The actual document itself is absolutely riven with ambiguity. There's no doubt about that. The question is whether Hussein recognizes that. My sense of Hussein is that he does recognize it. In other words, there is no wool being pulled over his eyes, because he's perfectly aware that if he's going to create a modern Arab empire, he's going to need some logistical, economic development, and that can only come from the outside world.
Taking Britain's assurances of support at face value, Hussein, together with his sons Faisal and Abdullah, amassed a sizable force. The new army was commanded by the young and charismatic Faisal, who had captured the imagination of the Arab masses in the quest for Arab independence. Yet even as Hussein and Faisal mobilized their troops, the British were preparing to sell them short. Back in London, in the spring of 1916, Britain was negotiating with France about the future shape of the Middle East. Behind closed doors, Sir Mark Sykes of the British Foreign Office had been meeting his French opposite number, François Georges-Picot. Britain knew it was vital to offer the French a stake in the spoils of the Ottoman Empire, should they win the war.
There was an awareness on the British side that they had made such huge sacrifices that one couldn't just ignore French ambitions, and that the French were determined to have their historical peace of the Levant.
In 1915, The Economist reported on Sir Mark Sykes' first-hand account of war in the Middle East. The local Arabs were preparing to fight alongside British and French allies to defeat the Ottoman Empire. Away from the fighting, the same British diplomat secretly plotted what would happen next. Mark Sykes and his French counterpart François Georges-Picot agreed to carve up most of the region between the British and the French. The map they created would set the tone for decades of turmoil.
This section here, which largely corresponds to the modern-day borders between Syria and Jordan and Syria and Iraq, was drawn with a ruler. I mean, it doesn't take into account local realities, political realities, tribes who have families on both sides of the border.
Poring over a map of the Levant, Sykes and Picot personally drew in the areas they wished to see under their control. Their secret deal amounted to the virtual carve-up of the Middle East. In Area A for the French and Area B for the British, the imperialists intended to exercise power indirectly. They would appoint advisors and take charge of the finances in their respective spheres of influence. Then there was the area coloured blue, which was to be directly controlled by France. This included what was then known as Greater Syria, where the French traditionally had commercial and religious interests. As for the area coloured pink, known as Iraq, with its strategic ports, railways and oil, this was to be under British rule. The area coloured yellow represented Palestine and was envisaged as an international zone, except for Haifa.
What the British wanted was the oil of Iraq, and they concentrated on getting Iraq and getting away from Iraq to the Mediterranean in order to transport this oil. So they got Haifa on the Palestinian coast, and they got most of Iraq.
The Sykes-Picot Agreement was a pretty shameful document, and I wouldn't attempt to defend it. But it was drawn up by people who were sort of operating under the old kind of balance of power considerations in an imperial frame of mind.
A century later, Sykes-Picot is no less potent and still fueling upheaval.
This is the so-called border of Sykes-Picot. We don't recognize it and we will never recognize it.
In 2014, ISIS broke through the border of Syria and Iraq, proclaimed a caliphate, and declared Sykes-Picot to be over.
It was a very strong message to the international community, and especially to the West, that we don't care about lines you drew in the sand 100 years ago.
This is Iraq, this is Sham. But now, this is all one country.
A century on from the Sykes-Picot Agreement, its legacy looks as tortured as ever.
100 years ago, it was very easy for men in suits in conference halls in the West, meeting in secret, to just draw lines across the sand. But today, it's going to be angry, armed, young men and women on the ground who are going to draw those lines with blood.
Unaware of these secret dealings behind their backs, Hussein and Faisal proclaimed independence and in June 1916 attacked the Turkish troops. The Arab revolt against the Ottomans had begun. The Turkish garrison at Mecca was soon overrun, and the seaport at Jeddah seized. By 1917, Hussein and Faisal's forces had pushed north and engaged the Ottoman Turks along the Hejaz Railway. The British saw the Arab revolt as part of its strategy for creating a military diversion against the Central Powers. In a pincer movement, Britain had launched a campaign from the southwest to ensure control of the Suez Canal and the Levant. And from the southeast, it was fighting to secure the oil wells of Iraq. All this to attack the Central Powers at their weakest point, the Ottoman Empire.
The Arabs hitched their fortunes to the British. They considered themselves to be fighting with the Allies, but at the same time they were not merged into the British army, that they continued to act as an independent army called the Northern Army.
While the Arab army advanced northwards, Britain's General Allenby had crossed the Suez Canal, and by
publication of the secret treaties by the Bolsheviks certainly created enormous suspicion in the Arab world, and this meant that the Sharif Hussein and the others said, wait a minute, what's going on? Why are you not giving us independence? And secondly, why are you dividing us up into Zone A and Zone B? And at that point, of course, the Arabs realized that not only had the British got their own particular interests, for example, in the ports of Palestine or in Iraq, but that they had promised other things to the...
Fearing that Hussein and Faisal might lose heart, the British government forwarded a message to them, reiterating British commitment to Arab independence.
The Arab race shall be given full opportunity of once again forming a nation in the world. This can only be achieved by the Arabs themselves uniting, and Great Britain and her allies will pursue a policy with this ultimate unity in view.
Hussein stayed loyal to the Allied cause, still prepared to accept Britain's word on Arab independence, although he spoke of...
The Arab revolt did contribute to the victory of the Allies. First of all, it protected the British flank in Palestine. Second, it kept a number of Turkish and German troops preoccupied. And third, the British could have never legitimized what they were doing unless they had the blessing of a particular Arab force.
On the 3rd of October, the people of Damascus flocked to Faisal's victory parade. If he was to seize power, he knew it was of great importance to make his presence felt and to be seen by the Arab people as their liberator. Later the same day, however, Faisal met with General Allenby at the Victoria Hotel in Damascus. Allenby warned him that his rule in Syria would be limited.
The British, by that time, knew that they were going to hand over Syria to the French, so they couldn't actually accept Faisal as a legitimate ruler. All they could do is to pay him his salary and the expenses of his army and his administration.
Undaunted by Allenby's warnings, Faisal assumed the title of governor of Damascus. With the support of his father, Sharif Hussein, he set about creating a power base for their goal of an independent Arab state. On the 31st of October, the Ottomans were finally defeated. The peace conference at Versailles began in January 1919.
Once independence had seemed to be a possibility, that this principle of self-determination, supported by the Americans, was going to be offered to all those who were to be liberated from former empires like the Habsburgs and the Ottomans. What the Palestinians wanted was an independent state.
In fact, Faisal had come from Damascus to plead the Arab cause. But the future of Palestine and the Middle East formed part of Britain's pledge to France in the Sykes-Picot carve-up. In the event, Woodrow Wilson's principles about self-determination were forgotten when it came to the people of the Middle East. Britain and France were free to go ahead with their agreement. The Versailles Peace Conference was concluded on June the 28th, 1919, with the creation of the League of Nations, the first global institution for peace and security. Its covenant provided that the Arab and other territories ceded by the defeated Ottoman Empire should be administered by mandates, which meant, in effect, that Britain and France were given the authority to impose their rule over the Arab territories. On November the 21st, 1919, François Georges-Picot, the co-architect of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and the French General Gouraud arrived in Beirut, and so began the imposition of the French mandate for Syria and Lebanon. The British forces, who had occupied the region since ousting the Ottoman Turks during the last months of the war, were handing over power to the French, thus fulfilling their wartime pledge. Faisal, who had been the governor of Damascus now for 16 months, had been consolidating his position. When he was proclaimed king by the Syrian National Congress, the French were incensed, and General Gouraud sent in his troops. By August the 7th, 1920, Faisal had been deposed and had to flee to Palestine. The promises to Sharif Hussein and Faisal of a single independent state were now a distant memory for the Europeans.
The whole issue of spheres of influence meant that what was at first appeared to be a willingness to accept a single Arab state was in fact seriously diluted. And then on top of that, of course, the very fact of there being a French area and a British area meant that in effect this was the seed of partition. So you had both independence was denied, but also the unity of this area was denied.
The boundaries and governments of the Middle Eastern states that emerged bore the unmistakable imprint of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. The French half of the previously Ottoman province of Greater Syria became the mandate for Lebanon and Syria. The other half became the British mandate for Transjordan and Palestine. In the east, the Ottoman area of Mesopotamia, which included the oil fields of Mosul, was given to Britain as the mandate for Iraq.
So this was basically the importance of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, to divide what is called the Fertile Crescent between Iraq and Syria and let Britain get access to the oil of the area and be able to exploit it in the future.
But British rule was initially rejected by the Iraqi people until Faisal was installed as king in July 1921. Britain hoped the limited power it devolved to him would serve to placate the frustrated demands for Arab independence. But Sharif Hussein expected more from the British.
He never gave up the idea that the British had promised him independence, not only in Arabia, but in Syria and Iraq as well. And he wanted the British to fulfill their promises.
Sharif Hussein's dream of an Arab kingdom ruled by the Hashemites was only partially fulfilled. For although his other son, Abdullah, became king of Transjordan, their old rival, Ibn Saud, swept the Hashemites out of Hijaz when he conquered the whole of the Arabian Peninsula.
That legend of the lonely nights around a castle which lies very hidden, inaccessible to the uninitiated, was part of nationalist German mysticism, which was influenced by Templarism. But who were the German Templars? The Temple Society is a German Protestant sect with roots in the Pietist movement of the Lutheran Church. Pietism is a movement that combines biblical doctrine with a reformed emphasis on individual piety. In spiritual terminology, piety is a virtue which may include religious devotion, spirituality, and humility, which originated in Germany in the late 17th century. Their members refer to themselves as Templars. Although the movement started exclusively within Lutheranism, it had a tremendous impact on Protestantism worldwide, spreading first to Switzerland, Scandinavia, and the Baltics, and the rest of Europe, then taken to North America, primarily by German and Scandinavian immigrants. There, it influenced Protestants of other ethnic backgrounds, contributing to the 18th century foundation of evangelicalism, a movement within Protestantism that today has some 300 million followers. The Templars were expelled from the Lutheran Church in 1858 because of their millennial beliefs. Millennialism is a word that comes from the Latin millenniaris, which means containing 1,000, and is the belief of a coming transformation of society after which all things will be changed, usually coming about after major cataclysms or other apocalyptical events. The word Templar is derived from concepts in the Bible, where every person and the community are seen as temples in which God's Spirit dwells. The Temple Society was founded by two men, Christoph Hoffmann, who was chairman of a German congregation of the Moravian Church, also called the Unitas Fratrum, Latin for Unity of the Brethren, one of the oldest Protestant denominations in the world, dating back to the Bohemian Reformation of the 15th century, founded in the Kingdom of Bohemia. The other was George David Hardegg, who in 1868 purchased land at the foot of Mount Carmel, a coastal mountain range in northern Israel stretching from the Mediterranean Sea towards the southeast, where Israel's third largest city, called Haifa, is located. At the time, Haifa had a population of 4,000 Arabs, and the Templars are credited today with the development of the city, with religious colonies spreading congregations to Jaffa, Jerusalem, and Sarona, where they established a regular coach service between Haifa and other cities, promoting tourism, making important contributions to road construction, and establishing a lot of agriculture. For example, the colony's oranges were the first to carry the Jaffa orange brand, one of the better known agricultural brands in Europe, used to market Israeli oranges to this day. Their aim was to promote spiritual cooperation to advance the rebuilding of the temple in the Holy Land, then called Palestine, in the belief that this foundation will promote the second coming of Christ. In 1898, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany visited the colonies and initiated the formation of a society for the advancement of the German settlements in Palestine, enabling the settlers to acquire land for new settlements by offering them low-interest loans. Waves of pioneer settlers followed in 1902, 1903, 1906, and 1907, with Templar communities in what was then called Palestine, now numbering in the thousands. Fast forward to World War I and the events associated with it, such as the Balfour Declaration. When the British Army conquered the Holy Land at the end of 1917, matters started to change for the German Templars. In July and August of 1918, the British sent almost 1,000 Templars to an internment camp near Cairo in Egypt. In April 1920, most were deported to Germany. All the property of the Templars of enemy nationality, meaning Germans, was taken into public custodianship. With the establishment of a regular British administration in 1918, Templar property and livestock was seized, labeled as enemy property, and rented out with profits collected by the British. In April 1920, the Allies convened at the Conference of San Remo, agreeing on the British rule in Palestine. Fast forward to 1933 and the rise of the Nationalist Socialist government in Germany. Many of the Templars that weren't deported officially joined the Nationalist German Party, who opened a branch in Haifa in 1934, followed by another one in Jaffa. At the time, it was not uncommon to see a Nationalist Socialist parade in the streets of Tel Aviv, with flags and uniforms in full regalia. This image was from Jerusalem, and you can see the flags for yourself out in the open. Here's an article from 1938, which was published in the 6th year of the transfer agreement, where German Jews voluntarily went to transfer camps from 1933 to 1939 and were not only given a ride to the Holy Land on German ships. Once they arrived, they were given back a large portion of their assets, whether it be money or things like real estate, with another portion of it going to Jewish organizations which used it for various common goods and services. You can find out more about it online, such as articles called Transfer Agreement on Wikipedia, or Jewish websites where it's called Havara Agreement. 100% available mainstream knowledge, even if it's ignored 100% by Hollywood and the controlled corporate media. The German camps were established to send people and their assets to Palestine by the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, something overlooked and left out by people like Steven Spielberg, but nonetheless part of history and factual reality.
Live on Channel 5, this is the 10 o'clock news with Deborah Norville.
Coming out revealing secret negotiation between the Nazis and the Zionists in 1933, which allowed German Jews and their assets to go to Palestine.
American Jews marched calling for the boycott of all German exports. Jews throughout Europe echoed that call, so did Jews everywhere. But a group of Zionists at the same time was quietly negotiating an agreement with the Nazis to allow the immigration of German Jews and the transfer of their assets to Palestine. That deal, reported in August 1933, was the transfer agreement. Palestine, sparsely settled by Jews at the time, was radically changed as a result.
I lived in Palestine from 1933 to 1936, and we saw every week transports of German Jews coming to settle in Palestine.
German Jewish settlement of Palestine was, for a time, official Nazi policy. These photos of Jewish life in Palestine, along with a lengthy text, appeared in 1934 in the Berlin paper Der Angriff. A Nazi Visits Palestine was the title of the multi-part series. A medal was struck by Goebbels in commemoration. On one side, the swastika. On the other, the Star of David.
That said, the relations deteriorated between the German Templars that spent decades building the community there and other migrants that were in political alignment with the British, some of whom emigrated from places like Russia in alignment with Russian Bolsheviks, who were the Marxist origins of the communist revolution that killed tens of millions and then became the Soviet Union. The British ran what is now Israel from the end of the First World War, and by the time of the Second World War, decided that after nearly a century in Haifa, the German Templars needed to be kicked out, deporting them en masse to Germany. Many of the children of the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of Yiddish-speaking Germans who populated Palestine from 33 to 39 are unaware of this history and are also taught propaganda in their schools. Yiddish, by the way, is one of the dialects of Alemannic Germany that belongs to the High German group, like Swabian, from the region of Bavaria, which leads us to these coins, which I showed in my last video, which I'll leave a link to in the description, which was about ancient symbols, such as a swastika and what some call the Seal of Solomon, both symbols appearing together on the same coin, as they also often appear together on ancient Phoenician archaeological sites, or ancient structures in places like Lalibela, Ethiopia, that contain both the swastika carved into stone churches, as well as the Seal of Solomon built by the Knights Templar. This is suppressed because it goes against the narrative pushed by modern post-World War II academia, media, Hollywood, as well as people who call themselves truthers that saturate social media with false information disseminated by the same globalist bankers that they claim to be united against.
In 1921, the Allies were still discussing how much Germany should finally pay. Aristide Briand, the French Prime Minister, wanted a definite sum to be fixed quickly, and Germany made to pay. The rebuilding of war-damaged France was costing the country a great deal of money. Why should the French be taxed more heavily to pay for all this, when the money could be squeezed out of Germany? But the Germans, who'd been summoned to hear the Allied demands, protested that these would place an intolerable burden on their people. They'd argued that the Germany to which they were returning had suffered poverty and unemployment in the years since the war and couldn't afford the vast sums demanded by the Allies. Germany was already in a bitter mood. Might not reparations only make things worse? But these arguments didn't impress the Allies, who fixed a sum of £6,600 million for the Germans to pay. That sum would have to be paid in goods as well as money. Most would come from here in the Ruhr, the industrial heart of Germany. But at the end of 1922, the Germans fell behind with their payments, and Raymond Poincaré, the new French Prime Minister, decided to act. If Germany wouldn't pay in full and on the nail, then France would help herself. So, on the 11th of January 1923, French and Belgian troops entered the Ruhr to force the Germans to pay up. There was, of course, after Versailles, no German army big enough to stop them. At first, the French believed that they could make the Germans work for them. But suddenly, German politicians and people were united in a common cause, hatred of the French, and huge protest meetings were held all over Germany. Workers in the Ruhr refused to cooperate with the enemy, and the German government supported the strikers. Germany's industrial heart stopped beating, and the goods trains, which should have been carrying German wealth to France, lay idle in the sidings. The French hit back by bringing in their own workers to get things moving again. Their attitude towards the Germans in the Ruhr began to harden. They tried to cut the Ruhr off from the rest of the country. German visitors were searched as if they were entering a foreign land. They deported the leaders of the passive resistance, German officials, and even the police. The result was violence. German workers had been killed in riots at Essen in March. Their funeral was turned into a vast demonstration of protest. Hatred grew. Germans began killing French soldiers. and at the funeral for one of them, tempers flared into acts of brutality. (1923) was disastrous for Germany. In that year, the great German inflation reached its peak. For some time, the value of the mark had been dropping, and as the value of the notes decreased, so the amount of notes needed to buy things grew. Banks became more and more hard-pressed to meet the ever-increasing demand for paper money. For their customers, suitcases replaced wallets. To meet this crisis and pay the strikers in the Ruhr, the government simply printed more money. And as it lost its value, so it cost more and more to pay wages, to buy food. Hundreds of thousands. Millions, whatever figure was printed on the notes, really meant nothing. The German mark was worthless. As in a fearful dream, people's life savings were blown away like leaves in a gale. As Germany slid towards disaster, Gustav Stresemann was appointed Chancellor. It was a time of crisis. The loss of production in the Ruhr was making inflation even worse, and Stresemann realized that the only way to help the economy back to normal was to call off resistance there and get production going again. The government also announced that Germany would resume the payment of reparations. It was the only possible way of getting the French out. But to the nationalists, it looked like yet another pathetic surrender to Germany's enemies. General Ludendorff, who'd never accepted that Germany had been defeated, gave his support to Adolf Hitler, the leader of the new National Socialist Party. In Munich, the capital of Bavaria, they decided to try and overthrow the government. But Hitler's stormtroopers were not yet powerful enough and couldn't get the support of the army or the police. Their November uprising failed and merely ended in confusion and 14 deaths. Ludendorff and Hitler were put on trial for treason. Ludendorff was let off. Hitler was sent to prison, where he brooded on his failure for a few months in rather comfortable surroundings. Meanwhile, inflation was being brought under control. The old worthless money was called in and destroyed, and replaced by a new currency. At the same time, a committee under Charles Dawes, an American, was set up by the Allies to scale down the reparations, so that Germany could afford to pay them. The German leaders came to London in 1924, and agreed to accept the Dawes plan. Stresemann's policy of cooperation began to pay off at that meeting. The French agreed to pull out of the Ruhr within a year. Their occupation had been unpopular with their most important allies, especially Britain, who'd refused to support their attempt to humiliate Germany. As German industry returned to normal after the chaos of occupation and inflation, Stresemann brought off another triumph, this time at Locarno in Switzerland. Under the Locarno Pact of 1925, France, Belgium and Germany agreed to respect the frontiers between them, and Britain said she'd support any country that was invaded. Old enmities seemed to be disappearing, and Germany no longer feared the threat of a French invasion. Finally, at Geneva in September 1926, Germany became a full member of the League of Nations. Aristide Briand, now Foreign Minister of France, welcomed Stresemann as an equal. It was all very friendly. By now, life in Germany appeared to be returning to normal. the Germans relaxed. The grim aftermath of the war, the humiliation of Versailles, the hysteria of 1923, all gradually faded beneath the surface of a new prosperity. For a defeated nation still paying for a lost war, the Germans appeared not to be doing badly. They could afford to live it up a little, have a good time.
As the Führer's grand tour draws to its end, he stands with the Duce and Italy's king and queen to watch the march past of the fascist army. And the fascist army also includes the women. But look what comes of dictators exchanging ideas. If it weren't for the fact that they do it slower and don't step so high, Hitler might think he was in Berlin instead of in Rome. And if he don't do it right, chop his head off. And then the trumpets ring out the news. They're open. And then Rome echoes to the roar of 10,000 machines, and the old walls of the Colosseum must be thinking that they're back in the days of the Caesar. Only now they're seeing double. There are two Caesars. And while the rest of the world wonders what next, the fascist nation shouts its approval as two strong men show each other just how polite they are. It's yours. Oh, no, it's yours. Oh, but most certainly yours.
During the last 3 months of traveling, I've gained the impression that Mr. Roosevelt's popularity is on the wane, but that it is not slipping fast enough to of itself destroy his chances for re-election in 1936. The great mass of open-minded Americans who are not blindly bound by party allegiances and whose votes really decide elections, again, have come to the conclusion that the Democratic Party cannot run this country. But they do not seem to have any more confidence in the old-line Republican politicians. Mr. Roosevelt will be re-elected unless he makes some false step and involves us in a foreign war which is surely coming. Just remember, too, that this administration has control of the vote-getting machinery and has control of $5 billion to spend as it sees fit. And as present-day politics go, you could elect an Eskimo with $5 billion.
The Lutheran Cathedral in Berlin is the scene of a wedding which is immensely popular in Germany. After a civil ceremony, General Goering, the Premier of Prussia, drives with his bride, Frau Emma Sonnemann, the famous opera singer, to the cathedral. The bride enters alone. She is followed by Germany's best man, Hitler, who on this occasion literally is best man to the general. As the couple leave the cathedral, they are greeted by the roar of tens of thousands of Germans amid scenes of amazing and unprecedented enthusiasm, which recall the pomp of the old imperial regime. They drive away on their honeymoon through streets lined with 33,000 soldiers and Nazi stormtroopers.
pledge undivided allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Ladies and gentlemen, fellow Americans, American patriots, I'm sure I do not come before you tonight as a complete stranger. You all have heard of me through the Jewish-controlled press as a creature with horns, a cloven hoof, and a long tail. We, with American ideals, demand that our government shall be returned to the American people who founded it.
If you ask what we are actively fighting for under our charter, first, a social, just, white, Gentile-ruled United States. Second, Gentile-controlled labor union, free from Jewish Moscow-directed domination.
Signor Mussolini arrives at Brunero, a village in the Brenner Pass, to meet the man who has caused more misery in the world than any other since history began. The two dictators shake hands, after which the Duce greets Ribbentrop, the man who said Britain wouldn't fight. The discussions between Hitler and Signor Mussolini took place in a private railway compartment. What was said in their 2.5 hours conversation can only be a matter for conjecture, but it's a pretty good guess that Hitler did not have things all his own way. More hand-raising and the visitors prepare to leave. Another handshake and Hitler is on his way home, a wiser, if not a happier man.
If there is a new world order, there must also be an old world order, which is very important to understand the new world order. The old world order was the feudal aristocratic system of kings, queens, dukes, counts and earls, whose property we were. They took our women in the prime noctus, or first rite on the first wedding night, and forced our women to sleep with the lord to spread their pharaonic genetics. They owned all the land, all the cattle, and had all the power, being enforced by their knights, who are now the police and the Blue Octagon Army. So you think they just left it all and just vanished? No. It was this old world order which became the new world order, because the aristocracy were having too many internal wars, where all of them wanted to be king or lord of the castle, and there were more and more of them. So it was decided that any one of them could be the king for a period of 4 years, elected by their slaves, the demos in Greek. And so democracy was born. And because there were too many uprisings and revolutions going on, they decided to become invisible and hide in secret Freemason lodges, being the reason that Freemasons are still attracted to swords, castles, ancient rituals and pharaonic symbols. Especially communism and the Russian Revolution became a real threat to them, killing all the royals and tsars. This is why in fact a counterpart had to be invented to defeat the threat, Nazism. And over these two they had the Western world and privileged capitalism of their financial elite to finally defeat both communism and Nazism. And now they just smile and say, have a nice day. Next to this, there's also the highly organized Templars of Octagon and their base Switzerland, where all the money is. The Templars were like young, wild, revolutionary aristocrats, rebels like, who had to fight for their kingdom, as they were only second or third sons, who therefore had no rights, and it was they who finally came up with the idea of democracy and Freemasonry, thus putting the old monarchies and the French king Philippe le Bel in rage, because he didn't want to give up his kingdom to the new system of the new world order, where all these pharaohs could have a chance. So the Templars founded Switzerland, taking their Templars' treasure with them. And today we still belong to them as their slaves, and that is why we have a passport or ID with a number on it, being our registered slave number of the aristocracy, which we have to show every time their police knights of Octagon commands us to control the flock. Not even the passport itself belongs to us, but it's the property of the state and aristocracy. Neither our children belong to us, they are the property of the state, whom they can take away from us whenever they please, as being their future flock of slave stock. They can arrest you whenever they want, they can put you in prison whenever they please. This is what I had to find out in Octagon, Switzerland, that we are their property, who can steer our lives through terror, lies and injustice. Look, there's even the coat of arms on it of the ones whose property you are. The king. The pharaoh. Well, there he is, King George VI and the Freemason, as I told you, who set Mr. Winston Churchill, the aristocratic warmonger and mass murderer who started World War II He set them in place. He was not elected by the people. And every American president has one British king as their ancestor. So the pharaohs became the aristocracy. And the aristocracy became Freemasonry, ruling through the system of democratorship, where we, the sheeple, can vote for one of them out of a bunch of other pharaohs. It says in the Bible that the pharaoh and his army disappeared in the sea. They disappeared in the sea of peoples and are amongst us. In pharaonic means pregnant, and ri means a son, as in the word aristocracy, meaning the son gave birth to them. They came from elsewhere. This is the King of England. There he is, a Freemason. They all are. That's how they control us today. Nice, isn't it? We are just their slaves, as we've always been. Now they're hiding.
How is the Europe of today?
Following the priests and the nobles, Tsar Nicholas of Imperial Russia with his wife and children. One day, all to find death in a bullet-swept cellar.
Не страдала теперь, я бы прожила жизнь, припеваючи, вы загубили меня, очи черные.
Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria pays a visit to Bosnia, to that very Sarajevo, where soon the assassination of his will spark off the First World War. Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, launching another ship in his country's drive to capture command of the oceans.
Mein Vater war ein Wandersmann und mir steckt's auch im Blut. Drum wandere ich froh, solang ich kann und schwenke meinen Hut. Ballerie, ballera, ballera, Ballerie, ballera und schwenke
But for the spectacular, you didn't have to travel as far as India. In those days, before all the crowned heads of Europe, was no empty phrase. And the last of a long line, the Sultan of Turkey.
Athens is in a state of turmoil over the announcement by General Kondylis, leader of the Royalist Party, that he intends to abolish the Republic and return to the monarchy. He has formed a new government and has announced a national plebiscite for early next month for the people to show whether they approve of his action. Meanwhile, ex-King George of Greece, at present living in London, refuses to return to his country until he's certain that his country wishes him to do so. After 12 years' exile, King George II of Greece leaves his hotel in London to return to his throne.
Under the warm sun of the south, King Victor Emmanuel of Italy. The king, even though not up to his stately wife's shoulder, and his was a dynasty to last the longest, at least until the Second World War.
King Carol of Romania, a ruler forced eventually to yield his throne to his son, the boy Prince Michael.
The three great leaders and their staffs of military and political advisors faced the inevitable battery of cameras. Through 5.5 years of war, we have long awaited this moment of the Churchill-Roosevelt-Stalin meeting, the Grand Alliance. At this point in our history, we know that Germany is to go into a straitjacket of Allied-imposed discipline. The blueprint of its future has been drawn, signed and sealed. Let a quotation from the communiqué issued from Yalta speak for us all. It is our inflexible purpose to destroy German militarism and Nazism and ensure that Germany will never again be able to disturb the peace of the world.
Destruction of the IG Farben explosives plant is part of the well-mapped Allied plan to blot out Nazi war industry. Lieutenant General Lucian Truscott, commanding the U.S. Third Army, oversees the job. "200 tons of TNT do the trick. Many of the buildings were constructed so that 2 floors were underground, well protected from our bombers. But now the job is completed and almost 80 buildings are leveled. The once powerful Nazi war machinery is slowly crumbling to dust.
As it goes without saying that these men have not been indicted because they are industrialists or because they exercise great power and control great wealth. These things are not declared as crimes by the law under which this tribunal renders judgment. And this tribunal is not a forum for debate over the relative merits of different economic systems. What these men are charged with
please the tribunal. The grave charges in this case have not been laid before the tribunal casually or unreflectingly. The indictment accuses these men of major responsibility for visiting upon mankind the most searing and catastrophic war in modern history. It accuses them of wholesale enslavement, plunder, and murder. These are terrible charges. No man should underwrite them frivolously or vengefully, or without deep and humble awareness of the responsibility which he thereby shoulders. There is no laughter in this case. Neither is there any hate. The first half of this century has been a black era. Most of its years have been years of war, or of open menace, or of painful aftermath. And he who seeks today to witness oppression, violence, or warfare need not choose his direction too carefully nor travel very far. This case, like any criminal proceeding, finds its justification only as part of this process of redemption and reconstruction. We have been told from the mountain to judge not that we be not judged, and we will do well to reflect upon and seek to comprehend this profound prohibition. The crimes with which these men are charged were not committed in rage or under the stress of sudden temptation. They were not the slips or lapses of otherwise well-ordered men. One does not build a stupendous war machine in a fit of passion, nor an Auschwitz factory during a passing spasm of brutality. What these men did was done with the utmost deliberation, and would, I venture to surmise, be repeated if the opportunity should recur. There will be no mistaking the ruthless purposefulness with which the defendants embarked upon their course of conduct. That purpose was to turn the German nation into a military machine and build it into an engine of destruction, so terrifyingly formidable that Germany could, by brutal threats and if necessary by war, impose her will and her dominion on Europe, and later on other nations beyond the seas.
I'm going to close with a reading from the Hermetica, from the Hermetic texts. Hermes was the Greek version of the ancient Egyptian god Thoth. The Romans knew him as Mercury. And in a dialogue, the Hermetica, many of them are dialogues between Thoth, Hermes, and various pupils of his. And in one called the Asclepius, a lament is presented. And it's like a prophecy. It's a bit like the Mayan prophecy. Egypt seems to stand as a metaphor for the whole world in this, and to my mind, for the world in our time. This lament, this prophecy is speaking directly to us. So it's Hermes speaking, and he's saying to Asclepius this: "Do you know, Asclepius, that Egypt is an image of heaven? Or to speak more exactly, in Egypt, all the operations of the powers which rule and work in heaven are present in the earth below. In fact, it should be said that the whole cosmos dwells in this our land, as in a sanctuary. And yet, since it is fitting that wise men should have knowledge of all events before they come to pass, you must not be left in ignorance of what I will now tell you. There will come a time when it will have been in vain that Egyptians have honored the Godhead with heartfelt piety and service, and all our holy worship will be fruitless and ineffectual. The gods will return from earth to heaven. Egypt will be forsaken, and the land which was once the home of religion will be left desolate, bereft of the presence of its deities. O Egypt, Egypt, of thy religion nothing will remain but an empty tale, which thine own children in time to come will not believe. Nothing will be left but graven words, and only the stones will tell of thy piety. And in that day men will be weary of life, and they will cease to think the universe worthy of reverent wonder and worship. They will no longer love this world around us, this incomparable work of God, this glorious structure which he has built, this sum of good made up of many diverse forms, this instrument whereby the will of God operates in that which he has made, ungrudgingly favoring man's welfare, this combination and accumulation of all the manifold things that call forth the veneration, praise, and love of the beholder. Darkness will be preferred to light, and death will be thought more profitable than life. No one will raise his eyes to heaven. The pious will be deemed insane, the impious wise, the madman will be thought a brave man, and the wicked will be esteemed as good. As for the soul, and the belief that it is immortal by nature or may hope to attain to immortality, as I have taught you, all this they will mock, and even persuade themselves that it is false. No word of reverence or piety, no utterance worthy of heaven will be heard or believed. And so the gods will depart from mankind, a grievous thing, and only evil angels will remain, who will mingle with men and drive the poor wretches into all manner of reckless crime, into wars and robberies and frauds and all things hostile to the nature of the soul. Then will the earth tremble, and the sea bear no ships. Heaven will not support the stars in their orbits. All voices of the gods will be forced into silence. The fruits of the earth will rot. The soil will turn barren, and the very air will sicken with sullen stagnation. All things will be disordered and awry. All good will disappear. But when all this has befallen Asclepius, then God, the creator of all things, will look on that which has come to pass, and will stop the disorder by the counterforce of his will, which is the good. He will call back to the right path those who have gone astray. He will cleanse the world of evil, washing it away with floods, burning it out with the fiercest fire, and expelling it with war and pestilence. And thus he will bring back his world to its former aspect, so that the cosmos will once more be deemed worthy of worship and wondering reverence. And God, the maker and maintainer of the mighty fabric, will be adored by the men of that day with continuous songs of praise and blessing. Such is the new birth of the cosmos. It is a making again of all things good, a holy and awe-inspiring restoration of all nature, and it is wrought inside the process of time by the eternal will of the Creator.